The heat wave straining the power grid in much of the country has led U.S. energy officials and lawmakers to press for more transfers of electricity among regions that largely operate their own sections of the grid. The Federal Emergency Regulatory Commission plans to meet with state utility commissioners next week in California to discuss interregional transmission planning. It's a key hurdle to keeping power reliable and affordable. So is the power grid in our state strong enough to survive the summer? We welcome into the conversation St. Clair Newbern IV. He's the CEO at Live Energy, Inc. He's an energy broker and consultant who helps buy and manage electricity and natural gas. St. Clair, thank you so much for joining us this morning.
Happy to be here.
All right, so, I opened up with the big question about the power grid. A lot of conversation right now about the heat. We are in the dog days of summer. We've even seen, grids have issues during the wintertime when it gets extremely cold, like it did in Texas last year. What are your thoughts on the power grid as it sits right now as we sit in the middle of summer?
Well, Texas had a major catastrophe with Winter Storm Uri, and after that, they really are trying to make sure that they don't have that happen again. So we've had 25 records set this year in terms of usage, and the grid has performed no problem. We haven't had any blackouts. We haven't had any issues. So far so good. We're gonna test it again today. In the Dallas area, it should be over 110 today, and so we're gonna get another test today. So far, it's held up, and we haven't had any major outages. And throughout the U.S., like the southern half of the country is under a La Nina conditions right now, so it's hotter and drier than normal. So we're getting a test across the country, and time will tell. August looks to be pretty rough as well, and we'll see here pretty soon if the grid can stand up to these temperatures.
So how often do states share power during extreme temperatures?
So Texas is unique. So Texas is an island. Back in the early 60s, I think it was, they had to make a decision on whether they wanted to send power across state lines. And they decided they did not want to do that because then they would have federal oversight through the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission. And so basically Texas decided they don't want to have the federal oversight. They wanted to operate their own grid without having to deal with the FERC. And so they have maintained this island. And so they don't ship power to the east or the west. And so when Winter Storm Uri happened, people were saying, oh, that's a shame. We should have had, connections to the east and west, and we could have imported power, and that would have saved us. But that's not really the case. Like I was watching it at the time, and there wasn't excess capacity in Louisiana that we could have shipped over to Texas, and there wasn't extra capacity in Texas that we could have shipped to Louisiana. So the idea that there's all this extra capacity when we have these winter events is kind of a myth. But they are trying to figure out, how do we move power from one location to another so that we can balance and support each other better in the future.
So would you say the process needs to be streamlined?
Yeah, I mean, there's so many big issues right now. One of the big issues too is that we're trying to integrate renewables into the grid, and it makes it so much more complicated because, like in Texas, we had 20,000 megawatts of wind, but then when the wind stops blowing, when it's really dry on really dry days and really hot days, the wind will drop down to under 1,000 megawatts. So you're literally having to account for you having 20,000 megawatts dropping down to 1,000 megawatts. And you've got to use natural gas or coal-fired generation to balance when it's dropping. And so the big topics are like, what is the grid going to look like? How much renewables do we want? How much renewables is smart? And how fast do we do it?
Yeah.
So historically, we would just build these big natural gas or coal-fired plants, and it was much easier to scale up. Now it's gotten a lot more complicated because we have these intermittent resources that we're having to balance around.
So, we're speaking here, St. Clair Newbern IV. Okay, so he's an energy broker, a consultant. Okay, so since you brought up renewable energies, you took me where I want to go. Talking about the power grid, and we've heard how the government wants to start transitioning people off of using gas to, the electric vehicles. And people talking about using, that energy. There's the thought out there that, well, if all these people start transitioning off of gas to electricity, well, it's going to, the grid's not going to be able to handle it. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, that's true. I mean, if everybody bought an electric vehicle this week, like the grid would totally croak.
Right.
Like there's no way we can handle it. So the thing is, like, I'm all for like new technologies, and I've got an electric truck. I ordered a Cybertruck, so like I'm all for it. But the idea that we can all buy electric vehicles this week, there's no way. You can't do it. And that's one of the biggest misconceptions. People think like, oh man, we should just go green. We should just do all renewables. Well, there's no way. It took us 100 years to get to the fuel mix we have.
Yeah.
And like every time that we have a transition, I'm using air quotes, it's like we develop a new energy source, but the old one doesn't go away. Historically, the old one doesn't go away. So like we went from literally biomass, burning wood and dung, over 100 years ago. Then we found oil, then natural gas, and coal, and so as we developed these new energy sources, we transitioned into using a new source, but the old source didn't go away. So we've got this like over history of adding new energy sources, but every time we added an energy source, we didn't get rid of the old one. And so people think that today we can just start using renewables and we're going to, all of a sudden stop using all fossil fuels. And there's just no way that that's going to happen. We would be reversing like a 200-year trend of adding energy sources. And so people just have to kind of, step back and look at, okay, if we want a certain standard of living, we're going to have to use a certain amount of energy. We're going to have to generate a certain amount of electricity. And that takes time to evolve into using new energy sources. And we've also got to be smart and use things like nuclear, which, sounds scary, but it's actually the cleanest, densest form of energy that we can possibly use, but we haven't permitted any new nuclear plants in forever. So there's a lot going on, and I think with what's going on in Europe, people are really starting to think, okay, how do we secure our energy future? How do we make sure that we're not going to repeat what Germany's having going on right now?
All right. St. Clair Newbern IV has been our guest. Sir, thank you so much for your time and insight, man. We really appreciate it.